there are a lot of serious things to talk about surrounding housing, and affordable housing is one of them.
100%.
This is a big issue, right? There's a couple of reports out recently. The NDP have talked a lot about affordable housing. This is it's so complex because some people say, well, the government should get into the procurement of old properties. And I've heard I chatted with Lisa Roberts while hosting the Rick Howe show about this NDP housing spokesperson, and she said that the government should procure some of these old buildings. And I don't think that they understand how complex the procurement is in buying these properties. And then what do you do with it? You got to refurbish it and all of that. It's extremely complex. What are your thoughts?
I think it's very, very complex. And, I don't know if the government's really in business for owning real estate. I think there is a little bit of economics around, owning real estate, but likely private owners will do it better than the government. I think if anything, governments, not just here in Nova Scotia, but across the country, are really trying to divest some of their assets.
Right.
They don't want to be owners. They want to be the ones that are doing the legislation and dealing with taxation and all these things. But they really want to implore, I think, owners to help with the affordable housing. And I know there's some programs that have been put out by different levels of government around creating so many affordable housing suites when they're doing developments, which I think is really cool. And, I think that's important. And I can tell you here in our province, they put in a rent cap temporary, and that's going to come off here in 2022 or when the state of emergency ends, whichever I think comes first. And housing will continue to be a challenge. There's more demand than there is supply. Rentals are at a 1-2% vacancy, which is very, very low. And, we're not building enough new homes or new rentals or enough affordable housing suites.
But how do you deal with the affordable housing situation and an open market in which developers can purchase on the open market properties? And we've been talking about this, right? This as well as anybody. It's an open free market. It's capitalism. It's getting as much bang for your buck as you can and maximizing profit. So how in that environment, which we all cleave to that open market industry, how do you then balance affordable housing in that? How does that work?
Well, I think it's the government programs that incentivize the builders to own them and develop them and hold them.
Subsidize,
and it could be HST tax credit transfers. It could be funding for these units. I don't think I'm a person that's personally a supporter of the government owning affordable housing. I think it needs to be privately owned, but I have no problem with the government supporting it with programs.
But that hasn't worked.
I think that it has worked. I think that there certainly have been some developments that have had, components of low-income housing that have
there have been some, but clearly, and we just cited these couple.
Maybe these programs haven't
solved the problem.
And I think part of it is mortgage funds are very inexpensive now, even for commercial lenders. So, for developers to be incentivized, it needs to be better for them than going to borrow the money from the bank. And right now, it's cheaper for developers to go and get a mortgage and do a regular type construction than it is to access some of these programs. And that's one thing the government didn't really have the foresight on. They didn't really think about the economics of the programs. But I think that to get any of these programs done by private owners, private developers, they need to have a level of incentive, and the incentive needs to be on par with what type of profit level they would get on some of these free market type developments. So I think the government has a step further that they need to take this, and I think they need to get the feedback from industry. I think they need to get the feedback from the developers. I think they need to get the feedback maybe from mortgage lenders, maybe the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and take that and then tweak the programs to be a better fit for developers and get them on side to create more of these units.
Do you think that there's potentially the opportunity when zoning or building applications are submitted by large investors here, the developers, that you could say, okay, you want to develop this type of property, you then have to have some type of blended housing as well? What are your thoughts on that?
I love that. And I'll tell you, one of the major issues here in urban Halifax is the height restrictions. I can tell you, I've seen so many proposals that developers have put through that have been shot down at HRM due to maybe either center plan or prior to center plan in terms of the height restrictions. We need construction in Halifax. In the late 90s and early 2000s, we had a moratorium on building, and now guess what? 20 years later, we are in a crisis. So the government of the day, 20 years ago, has dealt the people of 2020 and 2021 a bad hand, because you couldn't get a building permit. You couldn't build new homes because they were trying to, change that supply issue. They were trying to, there was too much supply in the market at that point. But guess what? 20 years later, it's a problem. So everything kind of happens in cycles. But I definitely think the supply issue, affordable, normal rentals, condos for purchase, single family homes, and all kinds of different mixed type of real estate is going to be important. And I think we need to implore our governments to work together. Really the province needs to work with the municipality. I think that's really the first step in creating the HST tax credits to incentivize, developers to be developing. And they need to increase the density, and we need to build up in Halifax.
What about property value? Because some might say, look, I've got my value of my property is what it is, and I'm not interested in affordable housing developments in my, there are some out there that would have that attitude, for good or for bad. It's just the reality of it. What are your thoughts on that?
You know what? I think that is a tough one. And, I guess it depends on, there's so many different factors. But we have some huge building lots ready to go in downtown Halifax alone that have been vacant for 10 years, 20 years.
Why are they vacant?
Because the economics of the projects don't make sense due to, what the city and the center plan have, in play. Yeah. There's been a couple really big developments in, Halifax in the last few years. We have a lot of cranes in the sky. When we think about, Southwest Properties, they've built a bunch of rentals. They've built condos. The Roy, there has been the Trillium. There's been quite a few new buildings built downtown, but it's all been premium housing, whether that's premium rentals, premium condos. But there is a lot of construction in the north end of Halifax, and there's certainly land in north end of Halifax.
Dutch Village Road, that area.
Dutch Village Road. Yeah. What about Yonge Street? By the Superstore, there are huge construction sites ready to go.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
I'm really keeping my eye on the Bloomfield development. I think that's going to be really interesting. That's in the north end. It's where the Bloomfield School was. Okay. So there's a mixed-use development in the works there, and plans and approvals, and forthcoming on that. Okay,
so again, to that, you're talking about developers that want to maximize profit, and that's fine in an open market. And housing and the value of their properties are what they are. If you put affordable housing in the mix, then they may push back and say, look, this is not working for what we want to do here. We want to put up this certain type of building, want a certain type of atmosphere. I'm just being realistic here. This might not sit well with some, but this is the mindset of people in an open market. So how do you regulate, legislate, whatever that?
You know what? I don't know. And I don't know about balancing out the socioeconomic challenges. I don't know.
But that's a part of this problem.
I think it's definitely a challenge. And is it palatable to developers to say, yes, every development you have to have a certain percentage of affordable housing? No. But can the developers be incentivized to want to do it? Obviously, the programs aren't having enough uptick.
Right.
Because the cost of funds are so low. So there needs to be further incentives or benefits to the developer to create these, affordable housing units. And I think that's definitely a challenge for the municipality and for the province. And, is Housing Nova Scotia working, in terms of the affordable housing that they have already? I think the condition of those properties are probably not as good as properties that are owned by private owners.
Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts, long-term scope on affordable housing here in our region?
I think that there's certainly some work to do. And I think there's work to do everywhere around affordable housing. Housing is such an important topic, and I think we haven't really talked enough about housing. And it's really been brought to kind of the forefront of a lot of people's conversations. It's been in the news, and, there's been, a lot of challenges, but I think it's just because of the demand in the market. Now we're starting to talk about it. Yeah. No one talked about housing 5 years ago. No one talked about housing 10 years ago. It wasn't even a conversation. So I think having these conversations, listeners that are listening to our show, talking about some of these issues, and, I think our leaders of today and probably our leaders of tomorrow are listening to our show. So hopefully, there's some good takeaways, and we're certainly willing to continue having the conversation. It's important.
And hopefully people want to continue to listen for our last segment, right?
Tune in. There's going to be, I think we're going to talk a little bit, obviously, more about properties, cottages. I think it's certainly very seasonally appropriate for cottages. Yeah. And now that the province has opened up, that you can now go to your cottage this week, I think people are definitely getting very excited, and lots of good optimism in the air.
You got it. That's Clinton Wilkins. My name's Todd Veinotte. It's Mortgage 101, your guide to home ownership on News 95.7. We'll be right back.